You can always tell people who have been taught by educators about how to learn effectively because they will say concept mapping. Here's a problem. Nobody ever went to check and see if concept mapping was as good as the other ways of learning. And when Jeff Karpicki, a cognitive psychologist, did exactly that in a paper that was published in 2012, he found that the best technique by far was retrieval practice. Far better than concept mapping. If we take a look, when you're first learning something, you have these weak sets of links in long-term memory. But each time you pull them from your own mind, you are actually strengthening those sets of links. Over the past decades, hundreds and hundreds of studies have shown that retrieval practice is extraordinarily valuable in our teaching. Some ideas for you are you can ask people when they're taking notes in your class, say, close your books. Okay, now I want you to jot down the key ideas, just a phrase of all the key things that I have taught so far. So others, you can ask them to draw a sketch of some ideas that you've covered. If they're reading something or watching a video, stop, jot down those key ideas. And you can also ask them, for example, what did we cover last week? I want you to jot that down and hand it in. Deeply related to retrieval practice is something called spaced repetition. It's a bit like building a brick wall. You lay a layer of bricks, mortar, and before you go too high, you let that mortar dry, and it takes time to build a nice solid structure. Metaphor is a very powerful technique for learning. And the reason is this. Let's say you know how water flows. So you know the current of water as it's flowing along. And it seems easy to you now, but when you were a baby, you played a lot with water. And it took you a while to figure out what was really going on. But when you have that concept of water, it becomes much easier to use those foundational connections that you formed when you learned that first concept to build and make a set of links that introduces the new idea of electrical current flow, which shares a lot in common with the flow of water. Now, is it exactly the same? Of course not. All metaphors break down somewhere. So you have a good metaphor, it works great for some things, but when it breaks down, as it eventually will, you just throw it away and you get a new metaphor. How do you come up with metaphors? The best, easiest way is to steal them. One thing I like to do is I like to read nonfiction books about whatever subject I'm teaching. Not the textbook, but someone who knows how to write well for popular audiences. They will have a wealth of nice metaphors that you can use in your classes. You can also ask yourself what a concept is like. The wackier that concept, the better. You can look online. Also, you can ask your students to develop metaphors. There is something about metaphors that helps students think creatively, especially if you ask them to come up with something wacky and funny. We want to talk about working memory, long-term memory, and octopuses. You know that you can hold information temporarily in your mind. If I gave you a number like 74295, you would probably hold it for a while as long as you were repeating it to yourself. Now, a few of you could come up with memory tricks and hold it longer in mind. But this working memory is for things we are holding temporarily and working with. Working memory is different than long-term memory. And long-term memory, the information is stored all over the brain, as opposed to working memory, which I like to model as a little octopus in the front of the brain that can hold 4 pieces of information. So you can see he's got 4 little arms. This is a really important part of learning, is learning something very well. And what we essentially want our students to do, once they've practiced with retrieval practice, they can hop up to the problem that needs to be solved. They pull those sets of links that they've well practiced with to mind, and they can easily solve that problem. What happens if a student has not used retrieval practice? They haven't checked to see if they placed that information in long-term memory. They were fooling themselves. They had it in working memory, but not in long-term memory. So retrieval practice has so many benefits. That relates to the hippocampal declarative learning and basal ganglia learning. To better understand these modes, we should go to my favorite athlete of all time, who is Julius Ego. He started watching online videos. Just doing that, he became the world champion in throwing the javelin. He was watching videos online, and then he'd go out and practice. So he was watching and practicing, watching and practicing. He was doing active learning. Here's what's really interesting. He was actually using 2 very different parts of the brain for his learning. Remember I said you've got sets of links you set in long-term memory. It turns out I was tricking you. There's 2 different ways, 2 different flavors of links in long-term memory. It depends on which pathway you use. You can take information from working memory through the declarative, the hippocampal pathway, but there's another pathway, and that is the procedural pathway through that mysterious basal ganglia. And I say mysterious because we are not conscious of this form of learning. This is learning of the kinds of things we do under habit. You speak your native language using the basal ganglia. That was the big learning pathway that allowed you to learn this. How do we teach to the declarative pathway? Well, retrieval practice actually will work for both. And spaced repetition helps both. If I explain to you, then you're learning declaratively. If you learn by practicing, particularly using something called interleaving, then that helps with your procedural sets of links. Interleaving just means mixing up concepts that are closely related to one another. The big thing is you are not conscious of what you're learning procedurally. That's why you're a little kid, you're learning your native language, you're not conscious of how you're learning, but you learn it. This learning develops through practice. You cannot explain it very easily. It's fast to use this system. This is why you can speak your native language so quickly and so intuitively. But it's also slow to learn, and it's kind of inflexible. So we need links from both pathways in order to help us to understand and work with anything we're learning.